New Guinea, August 1943. Dawn crept over the red clay airfield in a pale silver haze. The sun broke through the mist, washing rows of P-38 Lightnings in soft daylight. Engines coughed awake one by one, the air trembling with their deep metallic growl. Beneath the left wing of one aircraft, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched in silence, watching his pilot climb aboard. 23-year-old Lieutenant Robert Hayes was about to fly straight into 18 enemy fighters, and by every calculation, he shouldn't survive. McKenna knew the Lightning like a living creature. Twin boom body, twin engines, built for speed and altitude. But he also knew its secret flaw. It could never turn with a zero. Every day he watched pilots take off confident and, too often, never return. Official reports called it pilot error. The manuals blamed poor tactics, but McKenna's hands, calloused from months of tightening bolts and tracing control cables, told him something else was wrong. The problem, he believed, wasn't the men. It was in the cables, tiny fractions of slack that delayed the ailerons by the blink of an eye, a fraction that in combat meant life or death. That morning, as engines thundered across the field, McKenna made a decision that would break every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual and quietly change the balance of the air war. If you love forgotten stories of courage and ingenuity, subscribe, leave a comment, and stay with us. Every small act in war can rewrite history. At 7:42 a.m., Hayes rolled down the runway. Dust spiraled behind his silver aircraft as it lifted into the blazing tropical sky. McKenna stood watching, heart pounding, unsure if he had just saved a life or condemned one. War, in the lens of Life magazine, was never only about firepower and orders. It was about the quiet decisions made in shadows, between duty and conscience, between following the rules and saving a friend. And on that August morning, under the wing of a single fighter plane, one mechanic's silent defiance set the stage for everything that followed. The story of the P-38 Lightning was, in many ways, the story of American ambition welded to aluminum. Born in California hangars under Lockheed's bright skylights, it was the fastest twin-engine fighter of its day, capable of climbing above 30,000 feet and diving faster than gravity itself. But inside its sleek metal skin hid a subtle flaw that paper manuals never mentioned, a whisper of looseness, a pause in obedience. In the sweltering humidity of New Guinea, that flaw became fatal. Every mission seemed to end the same way, pilots turning too slow, zeros curling inside their arcs, tracer fire carving across silver wings. To headquarters, the losses were numbers. To Technical Sergeant James McKenna, they were faces, names written on maintenance logs, coffee mugs left untouched in the morning mess. He remembered the first, Lieutenant David Chen from Sacramento, another mechanic's son who talked about hot-rodding cars after the war. Chen's P-38 came back once, with bullet holes tight as a handspan along its tail boom. He swore the airplane hesitated when he rolled. 3 weeks later he was gone, caught in another turning fight. Then came Captain William Morrison, a seasoned ace with 11 kills. Radio chatter on August 3rd spoke of mushy controls. Moments later, his Lightning spiraled into the jungle. Again, the official phrase, pilot error. Again, McKenna refused to believe it. He began listening, not to officers, but to the aircraft themselves. When he plucked a control cable during maintenance, he could hear the tone. Tight cables sang a high metallic note. Loose ones gave a dull twang. Every P-38 on the line twanged. Within specifications, yes, but within tragedy too. One evening, his friend and fellow crew chief, Rodriguez of Texas, leaned against a fuel drum beside him. The sunset glowed orange over rows of grounded Lightnings. Rodriguez said softly, "You think there's a fix?" McKenna wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the jungle hills, and whispered, "There's always a fix. The question is whether we're allowed to make it." Rules were sacred in the Army Air Forces. No unauthorized modifications, no deviation from Lockheed's manuals. Yet the manuals were written 8,000 miles away, in clean offices far from sweat, mud, and death. Here, men died by the inch. McKenna's theory was simple. If he could preload the aileron cable, take out that 3/8 inch of play, the control surfaces would react instantly. But there was no official tool for it, no spare parts. What he needed was something small, strong, and flexible. A scrap of piano wire salvaged from a wrecked aircraft caught his eye. A 6-inch length of hardened steel used for trim tabs. He slipped it into his tool bag and said nothing. For weeks he carried that wire like a secret. Each dawn he watched pilots climb into their cockpits and vanish into the bright sky, knowing most would not return. Each evening he walked the line of battered aircraft, touching the bullet holes, smelling the hot oil and hydraulic fluid, listening to the insects hum. He began to feel the war as rhythm, takeoff, loss, silence, and behind that rhythm, the unbearable knowledge that he might be able to change it. Then came Lieutenant Hayes. Hayes was young, quiet, from an Iowa farm, his accent soft but his eyes restless. He followed every rule, every piece of doctrine. Never turn with a 0. 6 missions, 0 victories. After his wingman Parker was shot down screaming over Finschhafen, Hayes found McKenna in the hangar late one night. The light bulbs buzzed, rain drummed on the tin roof. Hayes stood beside his aircraft, hands trembling, and said, "If there's anything you can do to make her roll faster, anything, do it." He didn't care about regulations anymore. He just wanted a chance. McKenna saw the same exhaustion in Hayes' eyes that he had seen in every doomed pilot before him. He nodded slowly. "Come back in the morning," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Outside, the jungle night smelled of fuel and salt. Inside, one mechanic prepared to gamble his career, perhaps his freedom, on a theory no officer would sign off. He would spend the night alone with pliers, wire, and conviction, testing whether a few ounces of tension could bend the course of war. The hangar was quiet that night. By 2300 hours, most of the maintenance crews had gone to sleep, leaving behind only the low hum of generators and the buzz of insects against the lamps. Technical Sergeant James McKenna worked alone. The air smelled of oil and tropical humidity, the steel skin of the aircraft still warm from the day's sun. Inside the left boom of Lieutenant Hayes' P-38, he found what he'd been dreading: slack, exactly 3/8 of an inch of play in the aileron cable. A distance small enough to hide in a technical report, yet large enough to kill a man in a turning fight. He pulled a piece of piano wire from his pocket, 6 inches long, salvaged from a wreck weeks earlier. Using pliers, he bent it into a Z shape, his hand slipping twice, slicing his thumb open on the second attempt. Blood mixed with grease, streaking across the silver fuselage. He wiped it away on his coveralls and kept working. It took 8 minutes to form the perfect bend, a shape that would act as a tiny tensioner, adding less than half a pound of pressure to the control system, enough to remove the slack completely. Installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was narrow. He held the flashlight between his teeth, shadows jumping across the cables as his fingers searched for the clevis pin. When it fell into the dark cavity, he spent 5 minutes feeling through dust and rivets until he found it again. The edges of the metal cut into his arm, sweat beading down his neck. If an officer caught him, it would mean court-martial, maybe prison. But the thought that mattered most wasn't punishment. It was Hayes, 23, with the same fear he'd seen in every doomed pilot before. He forced the pin through, tightened it until it seated, and pulled the cable once more. No delay, no give. Perfect. When McKenna stepped outside the hangar, the sky was ink black and still. Far in the distance, engines murmured, Japanese night raiders passing unseen. He looked up, hand wrapped in a rag, and whispered to no one, "Hold together, girl. Just hold." He didn't sleep. At dawn, the field woke to another day of war. Fuel trucks rumbled down the line, armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds into gun bays, and mechanics moved like ghosts through exhaust haze. At 6:30, Hayes appeared, already strapped into his flight gear. Their eyes met. McKenna said nothing. Neither did Hayes. Some truth didn't need words. At 7:42 a.m., the Lightning took off, twin props roaring. McKenna watched until the aircraft was no more than a glint above the jungle. He remained there, motionless, listening to the silence that followed. For 17 minutes, he could do nothing but wait. Over Huon Gulf, at 13,000 feet, Hayes and his flight of 4 P-38s sighted 9 Japanese Zeros. The morning sun was behind them. Perfect position. Hayes was flying number 3. "Let's roll," his element leader called over the radio. They dove. Hayes picked the trailing Zero, pushed both throttles forward, and felt the engines surge. The airframe trembled as the speed climbed toward 380 miles an hour. He lined up the target in his gun sight and fired, a stream of tracers arcing through the pale sky. Sparks erupted off the Zero's wing, but it kept turning, rolling hard to the right. Hayes rolled to follow, and then he felt it. The response was instant. The stick moved and the airplane obeyed. No hesitation, no lag. The P-38 snapped into the turn like it had been waiting its whole life to do so. Hayes' breath caught. He rolled 90 degrees in half the time he expected, drew a perfect lead, and squeezed the trigger again. The Zero's engine exploded in flame, the fuselage disintegrating as it plunged toward the jungle canopy. 1 kill. He didn't celebrate. 3 more Zeros were diving on him from above. He shoved the throttles forward, began to climb, but they were faster. Running meant death. For the first time, Hayes ignored the manual. He reversed. The Lightning rolled left so fast it startled him. He pulled through the horizon, saw the lead Zero exposed mid-turn, and fired. The enemy aircraft folded in half, wings tearing free, smoke trailing as it fell. 2 kills. The remaining Zeros tried to scissor, trading turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, his aircraft snapped with them. Fluid, immediate, almost telepathic. It was like flying a new machine, lighter, sharper, alive. When 1 Zero overcommitted and bled too much speed, Hayes got inside its turn, fired a 3-second burst, and saw it shatter in midair. 3 kills in less than a minute. When it was over, Hayes was trembling, drenched in sweat, fuel low, ammunition nearly gone. He climbed back toward formation, joined his flight, and turned for home. At 9:03, his Lightning touched down at Dobadura. McKenna was waiting. The engines wound down to silence. Hayes climbed out, his hands still shaking, and met McKenna's eyes. He said only 2 words. It worked. When Lieutenant Hayes landed that morning, word traveled faster than radio. Pilots who had seen the fight from altitude couldn't stop talking about it, about the way Hayes' Lightning rolled, the way it snapped through maneuvers as if gravity itself had lightened its grip. Captain Frank Mitchell, a veteran of dozens of sorties, described it simply: that P-38 moved like it was half its weight. He knew Hayes. He knew no man could have flown that way without help. 2 hours after landing, Mitchell found McKenna back in the maintenance area, hands still black with grease. "What did you do to his airplane?" he asked quietly. McKenna hesitated. Then he told him everything. The piano wire, the extra tension, the violation of every maintenance regulation in the book. Mitchell listened without blinking. When McKenna finished, the captain said only, "Can you do mine?" That evening, under fading tropical light, McKenna repeated the process. Same wire, same careful bend, same silent prayer. Mitchell took off the next morning and returned grinning, eyes wide behind oil-smudged goggles. "It rolls like a fighter, not a freight truck," he said. Within 2 days, his wingman wanted it too. By week's end, 9 aircraft carried the secret fix. No paperwork, no authorization, only whispered conversations in ready rooms and hangars. Crew chiefs passed the instructions like contraband. Cut 6 inches of piano wire. Bend it into a Z. Install inline at the cable junction. Takes 8 minutes. Changes everything. Each one knew it could mean court-martial. Each one did it anyway. By late August, the results were undeniable. In July, the 5th Air Force had lost 2 P-38 Air East for every 0 destroyed. By the last week of August, the ratio was nearly even. Pilots were returning from missions with stories of impossible rolls, reversals that left Japanese fighters spinning out of their own turns. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American flyers were not just surviving, they were winning. The Japanese noticed. Combat reports from the 11th Air Fleet began to mention something new. American lightnings that turned with unexpected quickness, that could reverse direction immediately. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's celebrated ace, met one over Wewak on September 3rd. He executed the same trap he had used to kill countless Americans: draw them into a turn, then snap inside their radius. But this time the P-38 reversed with him, faster than physics should have allowed. Sakai barely avoided collision, dove for cloud cover, and returned to base shaken. He had not been outflown often. That day, he was. As word spread through both sides of the Pacific, morale shifted in ways statistics could never measure. American pilots, once cautious, began to believe again. Japanese pilots, once invincible, began to doubt. Tactics that had worked for 2 years suddenly failed. The unseeable 6 inches of piano wire had changed the geometry of confidence. Meanwhile, officers back at Dobodura grew suspicious. Inspection teams noticed minor discrepancies in cable tension readings, but could find no alterations. The mechanics were careful. They removed the wire before inspection, reinstalled it afterward. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everything had. In September, the skies above New Guinea told a new story. Lightnings rolled through turns that once spelled death. Dogfights that began as traps ended as victories. For the first time, American fighters were claiming zeros faster than they were losing aircraft. 38 Japanese planes fell that month. 22 Lightnings did not return. For the first time, the numbers leaned toward hope. The change rippled outward, invisible yet unstoppable. Across the Pacific, crew chiefs began hearing rumors. There's a mechanic in New Guinea who figured it out. Some called it the McKenna trick. Others simply called it luck. But every man who flew a modified P-38 felt the same truth in his hands. The stick responded like thought itself. No delay, no lag, no hesitation between will and motion. The Army Air Forces didn't issue a memo, but they didn't stop it either. Sometimes progress needed to break a rule to prove it mattered. And in that quiet defiance lay the essence of wartime innovation. Not committees, not factories, but hands in grease, and hearts unwilling to watch another pilot die. By October 1943, the quiet revolution had reached command desks. A maintenance inspector at Dobodura, puzzled by inconsistent cable readings, filed a report that climbed the chain of command. The memo described an unapproved field modification involving non-standard wire tensioners. No one in the offices of Brisbane or Washington knew what to make of it. They debated whether to court-martial the mechanics or thank them. Lockheed's engineers in California finally received samples a month later. They measured the tension, studied the stress loads, ran flight tests over the desert. The verdict was simple. The modification was safe, effective, and should have been part of the original design. By December, the next production model, the P-38J, rolled out of Burbank with a redesigned control system. No piano wire, no field improvisation, just the factory's polished version of a sergeant's midnight defiance. But the paperwork never mentioned McKenna. On the line in New Guinea, the war moved on. Pilots rotated out, new ones arrived, and the trick spread until it was no longer a secret, but a quiet standard. For those who had lived it though, the memory stayed sharp. The nightlight glinting off steel, the sound of a cable tightening, the moment an airplane felt alive. Lieutenant Hayes flew 63 combat missions after that morning. He shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, survived the war, returned to Iowa, and married his high school sweetheart. Every year on August 17th, He picked up the phone and called McKenna in Long Beach. The conversation never lasted long, just 2 words that said everything. "Thank you." Captain Frank Mitchell went on to lead his own squadron through the Philippines campaign, finishing with 16 confirmed kills. He retired as a colonel in 1963. For the rest of his life, he told young officers the story of a mechanic who saved pilots not with rank or medals, but with stubborn courage and a 6-inch wire. James McKenna stayed in the service until 1946, then came home to California. He opened a small garage on Atlantic Avenue in Long Beach, fixing cars instead of fighters. The walls smelled of oil and paint, and sometimes when the sunlight hit just right, the wrenches on his workbench glimmered like propeller blades. He never spoke much about the war. When asked, he said, "I fixed airplanes, that's all." Decades passed. Engines changed, wars changed, but the pattern remained. Innovation rising quietly from those who worked with their hands. In 1991, a military historian researching field modifications in the Pacific came across a few obscure maintenance logs referencing wire tension adjustments. He tracked McKenna down, now 73, and still working part-time in his garage. McKenna confirmed the story. "It wasn't anything special," he said. "Just something that needed doing." The historian calculated that the modification may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots, young men who came home because one mechanic ignored a regulation. McKenna didn't count. He only remembered the names that mattered: Hayes, Mitchell, Rodriguez, and all the others who returned alive. When he died in 2006 at 88, his obituary mentioned his service as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire. It did not mention that he had changed the way a fighter moved through air and history. But in a small framed photograph, hung on the back wall of his old garage, the truth remains. A young man in oil-stained coveralls stands beside a silver P-38 Lightning. On the back, written in faded pencil, Dobadura, August 1943. That's how innovation really happens in war. Not from design committees or factory blueprints, but from those who see a flaw, believe they can fix it, and act before it's too late. Rules can guide an army, but courage repairs its heart. If you found this story moving, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, and share it with someone who loves forgotten history. Every voice that remembers keeps these stories alive and ensures that quiet courage is never lost again.